The biting wind at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport cut through my wool coat like a sharp blade. The harsh fluorescent lights burned my tired eyes. Terminal 5 echoed with the frantic clatter of luggage wheels and loudspeaker announcements. I stood frozen behind a massive concrete pillar. My trembling hands clutched 2 steaming cups of coffee. The rich aroma of roasted coffee beans mixed with the cold, metallic smell of jet fuel. 50 feet in front of me, the international arrivals gate swung open. A man walked out into the crowd. He wore a light linen shirt and designer sunglasses. His nose was noticeably sunburnt. He laughed, a familiar, loud sound that made my stomach turn into a tight knot. He reached down and wrapped his arm around the waist of a young woman in a breezy sundress. He pulled her close and kissed her deeply on the lips. The coffee cup slipped in my grip. My knees buckled. Hot liquid splashed over my fingers, but I felt no pain. The man kissing another woman in front of hundreds of strangers was Brandon Carter, my husband of 5 years. The man who had texted me 2 hours ago, claiming he was shivering in a freezing conference room in Wisconsin. My chest tightened. Anger surged through my veins like boiling oil. I took a step forward, ready to hurl the scalding coffee into his face. Before I could move, a firm hand clamped onto my wrist. I turned. My father, Arthur Bennett, stood beside me. His face was unreadable, his eyes as cold and analytical as when he worked as a senior auditor for the IRS. "Don't," my father whispered. His voice was steady and terrifyingly calm. "Screaming in public loses face. A public scene destroys a man's pride for a day. Stripping his wealth destroys his life forever. Let us teach him a lesson he will never forget." My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The screen flashed Brandon's face. My father looked at the phone, then looked at me. "Answer it," he instructed softly. "Put it on speaker." I took a deep breath. I forced my voice into a bright, affectionate tone. "Hey, honey, how is the retreat?" Brandon's voice filled the space behind the pillar, accompanied by fake shivering noises. "It is miserable, Evelyn. The wind chill downtown is brutal. I am stuck in these endless meetings. I miss you." Over the rim of the pillar, I watched him grin. The young woman ran a manicured finger down his chest. "Stay warm, babe," I said, my mouth tasting like copper and ash. "I love you." "Love you too," he lied flawlessly and hung up. I stared at the black screen. The trusting, dedicated wife died, right there on the cold tile floor of Gate 24. To understand how I became the architect of my husband's total ruin, we must go back to where the cracks in our foundation first began. My name is Evelyn Bennett. I am 30 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have worked as a senior corporate accountant for a mid-sized firm in Chicago. My life was governed by spreadsheets, precise metrics, and clear financial ledgers. I prided myself on seeing patterns before others did. I bought my own 3-bedroom home in the suburbs 2 years before I even met Brandon. I built my savings dollar by dollar. Brandon was 33, a commercial real estate agent with big dreams and an insatiable need to project success. When we met, he possessed a magnetic charm that filled every room. But as the years passed, his ambition turned into arrogance. He craved the lifestyle of the city's elite. He wanted the tailored suits, the country club memberships, and the expensive watches. Yet his actual commission checks rarely matched his grand claims. I became the silent foundation of his life. My steady 6-figure salary paid our mortgage. My pristine credit score secured our auto loans. I managed our household budget, paid off his early career debts, and cooked hot dinners after long hours at my desk. Brandon took it all for granted. To him, my career was merely boring paperwork. He referred to my work as low-tier spreadsheet pushing. He convinced himself that he was the visionary, and I was just the background noise supporting his rise. I accepted his condescension for far too long. I believed that marriage meant supporting your partner through their insecurities. I thought my quiet sacrifices were building a future for us. I did not realize I was feeding a predator who was actively plotting my financial execution. My father had flown into Chicago that very afternoon for a planned 2-week visit. Arthur Bennett had spent 30 years investigating tax fraud and corporate money laundering for the federal government. He was a man who saw through facades instantly. When he picked up his luggage, we were supposed to drive straight to my house for a quiet dinner. Instead, we stood in the airport terminal watching my husband collect luxury suitcases with his 26-year-old mistress, Chloe Montgomery. Chloe was a junior broker at Brandon's firm. More importantly, she was the daughter of City Councilman Montgomery, a man with deep political connections and access to high-end investment trusts. Brandon was not just having a foolish affair. He was trying to buy his way into a political dynasty. "We do not cry, Evelyn," my father said as we walked silently toward my car in the parking garage. The cold wind whipped around us, but my mind was completely clear. "We calculate." We got into my sedan. The engine hummed to life. I looked at my father in the passenger seat. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap. His jaw was set in a hard, rigid line. "He thinks you are weak because you are kind," Arthur said, turning to look at me. "He thinks your intelligence ends at your office door." Tonight, we begin mapping his entire network. We leave nothing behind. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The pain in my chest hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. Brandon wanted a game of illusions. I was about to give him a masterclass in reality. The front door of my suburban home unlocked with a heavy, metallic click. The scent of lavender air freshener filled the foyer, but the warmth of home was gone. My father, Arthur Bennett, followed me inside. His sharp eyes scanned the hallway like an investigator entering a crime scene. "Open the safe," Arthur commanded. "Before we plan, we must secure your baseline." I walked into my home office. I stepped behind the oak bookshelf and swung the hidden panel open. The heavy steel safe sat embedded in the wall. I spun the combination dial. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The heavy bolt retracted with a dull thud. I pulled the steel door open. My breath hitched. Cold air rushed out of the dark void. The safe was completely empty. The velvet pouches holding my grandmother's vintage gold necklaces were gone. The thick envelope containing my emergency cash reserves had vanished. Most terrifying of all, the original property deed to my home, purchased with my own money 2 years before I met Brandon, was missing. "He did not just break his vows," Arthur whispered, tapping the empty steel shelf. "He stripped your safety net. He mapped your assets and executed a systematic extraction." My hands trembled. The urge to collapse onto the floor and scream threatened to overwhelm me. I had just seen my husband kissing another woman at the airport, and now I stood robbed in my own home. "Do not crumble, Evelyn," Arthur said firmly. His hand settled on my shoulder, solid and grounding. "Tears do not recover stolen capital. Numbers do. Open your laptop. We audit every account right now." We moved to the oak dining table. Minutes later, the glowing screen illuminated my browser. I logged into my personal savings account. Access denied. I tried my primary checking account. Access denied. He changed the security questions. I whispered, my throat dry. "Call the automated phone system." Arthur instructed, uncapping a pen over a legal pad. "Use your social security number." I dialed the number and put the speakerphone on the table. The robotic voice echoed in the quiet room. My savings account, which held $40,000 last month, had a remaining balance of $12. The joint checking account was overdrawn by $300. Brandon had drained everything. At 8 o'clock that evening, the sharp crunch of tires on the driveway shattered the silence. Arthur stayed upstairs in the guest room, out of sight. I cleared the dining table, smoothed my dress, and stepped into the foyer. The front door swung open. Brandon stumbled inside. The scent of expensive cologne and faint tropical rum filled the hallway. He dropped his leather bag onto the floor with a heavy thud. He rubbed his hands together and shivered dramatically. The wind chill in Wisconsin was brutal, babe, Brandon groaned. Endless meetings. I am exhausted. He reached into his coat pocket and tossed a cheap plastic Chicago keychain onto the granite counter. Grab this at the hotel gift shop for you. I stared at the tacky plastic trinket. I smelled the ocean salt on his skin. I saw the fresh, peeling sunburn along his nose. You poor thing. I smiled sweetly, wrapping my arms around his neck. Come eat. I heated up dinner for you. During dinner, Brandon dominated the conversation. He poured a heavy glass of red wine, his cheeks flushed with arrogant energy. He launched into a long fictional monologue about his grueling week closing real estate deals. Then he turned his condescending gaze onto me. And how was your little week, Evelyn? Still pushing those boring spreadsheets? He let out a short, patronizing laugh. I deal with high-stakes capital and real risk. You stare at glowing rows of numbers all day. It must be nice having such a simple, low-tier job without any real pressure. A week ago, those words would have wounded my pride. Tonight, they were music to my ears. I let my shoulders slump. I looked down at my plate with a submissive expression. You are right, honey, I murmured, keeping my voice soft and weak. My work is very simple. I could never handle the immense pressure you face every day. Brandon's chest puffed out. His ego swelled, completely blinded by my apparent submission. The next evening, Brandon insisted we attend dinner at his mother's house. Victoria Carter lived in an opulent estate in an affluent gated community. The air inside her home smelled of heavy lavender candles and expensive wine. Victoria sat at the dining table alongside Brandon's sister, Monica. Throughout the meal, Victoria executed a masterclass in psychological warfare. She glanced at my plain navy dress and sighed, theatrically. Evelyn, darling, you look so washed out lately, Victoria remarked, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. That spreadsheet job is clearly draining your youth. You really ought to put more effort into your appearance if you want to keep up with Brandon's rising career. Monica smirked into her wine glass. It is pure exhaustion, Mom. Evelyn just lacks the drive for high society. They were planting seeds. Brandon had already convinced them that I was unstable, unappealing, and financially reckless, laying the groundwork to justify his eventual exit. I sat in quiet silence, absorbing their insults without letting a single tear fall. They mistook my silence for weakness. They had no idea I was taking mental notes of every word. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of my office, casting long, sharp shadows across the oak floor. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and hot computer exhaust. On my laptop screen, lines of decrypted data scrolled past in bright, relentless green text. The keystroke logger installed 2 nights ago had performed flawlessly. Every login, password, and portal Brandon accessed was mapped out before me. I called my brother-in-law, Marcus Hayes, who worked as a financial crimes specialist at a major national bank. Within 20 minutes, Marcus sat at my dining table, his dark eyes grim behind rimless glasses. He plugged a secure, encrypted drive into my machine. Brandon triggered 3 red flag alerts in our internal compliance system last week, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. He thinks he was being clever, moving funds through local title companies. Marcus opened a digital PDF file. My breath caught in my chest. Staring back at me was a loan origination document for a home equity line of credit, a $200,000 mortgage drawn against my home 4 months ago. I scrolled to the final page. Right above the line for my name was my signature, executed in fluid, elegant loops. Except I had never signed it. "He forged your name," Marcus explained, pointing to the notary seal. He used a corrupt notary public in his commercial real estate network to bypass in-person verification. Marcus clicked another tab, pulling up a maritime registry document. The $200,000 had been wired directly to a Delaware LLC, which purchased a 50-foot customized motor yacht. The co-owners listed on the deed were Brandon Carter and Chloe Montgomery. My hands did not shake. The panic that once strangled my lungs had completely dissolved. I felt only a cold, crystalline focus. My father, Arthur Bennett, leaned over my shoulder. He looked at the routing numbers and smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. "This is bank fraud and identity theft," Arthur said. "I am submitting a confidential whistleblower filing to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS today. The federal government will trace every dollar." The next morning, I began my physical and mental transformation. I refused to let grief wither my body or mind. I woke up at 5 o'clock every morning to run along the cold, crisp shores of Lake Michigan. The sharp winter air filled my lungs, clearing away the lingering haze of betrayal. I traded my drab, oversized clothes for tailored charcoal, and navy suits that reflected my true authority. I enrolled in an executive financial risk certification program, sharpening my technical skills every evening after work. I met with my attorney, Marcus Vance, in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Chicago. Vance was a formidable corporate litigator with sharp eyes and a bespoke Italian suit. He sat across from my father and me, reviewing the documents Brandon had left on my desk earlier that week. Brandon had been pressing me relentlessly to sign over my personal stock portfolio, funds I had built since my early 20s, into his new commercial real estate LLC. He believed I was a cowed, submissive wife who would hand over my life savings without question. "We are not going to fight this in a standard divorce court," Lawyer Vance said, a cold smile touching his lips. "We are going to set a ratification trap." Vance drafted a formal document titled Ratification of Financial Obligations and Separate Asset Reservation Agreement. It looked like standard corporate boilerplate, dense with complex tax jargon. But deep within the legal text, Vance embedded a lethal clause. It explicitly stipulated that if any documented financial fraud, forgery, or marital misconduct occurred, the signatory immediately forfeited all claims to marital equity, surrendered all rights to the spouse's separate property, and assumed full personal liability for all debts. Brandon did not consult an attorney. His monumental ego convinced him that I was too uneducated in high finance to understand the paperwork. On Thursday evening, the kitchen smelled of seared ribeye steak and fresh rosemary. I had cooked Brandon's favorite meal, playing the part of the apologetic, obedient spouse. He sat at the Marble Island, sipping single malt whiskey, radiating victorious arrogance. I brought the thick folder from my office and set it next to his glass. I read through the documents. "Honey," I said, forcing a hesitant, soft tone. "I am sorry I doubted your financial genius. I trust you." I signed the transfer line on page 42 with a steady hand. Then I pushed the document and a black pen toward him. I pointed to the reciprocal line right below the ratification clause. "The bank requires your signature as managing director to finalize the absorption." Brandon did not read the paragraph above the dotted line. He did not pause. He looked at my signature with greedy, triumphant eyes. He picked up the pen and scribbled his name with a sweeping flourish. "It is about time you recognized my value, Evelyn," Brandon scoffed, snatching the folder into his hands. "Leave the big decisions to men who actually understand wealth." I smiled softly and nodded, watching him clutch his own financial death warrant against his chest. Over the next 2 weeks, I took complete control of my independent life. I went to my bank and transferred my liquid salary into a new, separate account under my maiden name, shielded by Lawyer Vance's legal trust. I updated the security protocols on my personal property, changed all my digital passcodes, and secured my house deed records with the county registrar. I stood taller. My skin glowed with health. My mind moved with mathematical precision. Brandon walked through our house believing he had conquered me. He had no idea that the quiet woman sitting across from him was no longer his victim, but his executioner. The fluorescent lights of the concrete safe house hummed with a low, steady vibration. The air was cold, smelling of ozone, heavy-duty climate control, and fresh bitter coffee. My father and I sat at a folding table, surrounded by glowing data monitors. A massive file packet arrived from the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. My father, Arthur Bennett, unencrypted the federal audit logs. The data revealed a horrifying web of money laundering. Brandon had not acted alone. The registered agent and primary beneficiary of the shell companies used to launder embezzled commercial real estate funds was my mother-in-law, Victoria Carter. Victoria had used her pristine social standing and charitable foundation to park millions of dollars of stolen corporate capital. She then routed those funds directly into the Political Action Committee controlled by City Councilman Montgomery, Chloe's father. My father stared at the monitor, his weathered hands tightening into hard fists. He looked at me, taking a slow, measured breath. "It is time you understood why Victoria harbors such hatred for us, Evelyn," Arthur said softly. "Decades ago, long before he met my mother, Arthur was married to Victoria. She was a woman driven by an insatiable hunger for prestige. When my father's steady auditor salary could not provide immediate luxury, Victoria engaged in a secret affair with a wealthy political developer. She systematically drained my father's business accounts, framed him for fraud, and buried him in litigation. He cleared his name, but the scars remained. "History is repeating itself," Arthur said, his eyes meeting mine. "She groomed Brandon to execute the exact same playbook against you. But this time, we stop her." That night, my brother-in-law, Marcus Hayes, cracked the final layer of biometric security on Brandon's hidden cloud drive. The master folder was titled Project Phoenix. The screen flickered, displaying a directory of invoices and event schedules. Brandon was hosting a massive, lavish gala to celebrate our 5-year wedding anniversary at the Grand Conservatory, an opulent, glass-domed architectural marvel downtown. Every expense, from the $50,000 catering deposit to the cascading floral installations, was paid for with the home equity line of credit fraudulently drawn against my house. Marcus opened a subfolder titled Media Assets. He played a high-definition video file. My blood ran ice-cold. The screen showed a dimly lit luxury hotel room. A woman walked into the frame, turning her face toward the camera. It was my face. It was my voice. But the video was completely, terrifyingly fake. Brandon had wired $80,000 to an offshore tech group specializing in deepfake rendering. The document itinerary revealed his exact plan. At 9 o'clock during the gala, Brandon would step onto the main stage to offer a toast. He would press play, broadcasting the fabricated video of my infidelity to a captive audience of regional politicians, corporate executives, and socialites. As I fled the venue in disgrace, Brandon would play the devastated victim. He would then call Chloe Montgomery to the stage, praise her as his rock, and publicly propose to her, using my stolen money. The safe house fell dead silent. My father's knuckles turned bone white. Marcus looked at me with a silent apology. I did not cry. I felt no urge to scream. The disgust in my stomach crystallized into absolute, lethal focus. Brandon wanted a grand theatrical stage. He wanted an elite audience to witness my execution. "We do not cancel his gala," I said, my voice level and quiet. "We let him stand on that stage. We let him speak into the microphone. And then we replace his fake video with the undeniable truth." For the next 24 hours, our safe house operated as a silent command station. Marcus wrote a custom digital override script to hijack the Grand Conservatory's audiovisual system. My father finalized the federal evidence packet, linking Victoria and Brandon directly to tax evasion and wire fraud. On the evening of the gala, I stood in my bedroom at the safe house. The air smelled faintly of silk and expensive lavender perfume. I slipped into a bespoke emerald green silk gown. The heavy fabric draped perfectly around my frame, acting as a tailored suit of armor. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The pale, anxious woman who had cried in a cold airport terminal was gone. In her place stood a woman of absolute authority and unshakable calm. I picked up my evening clutch, checking my secure phone one last time. The traps were set. The digital guillotine was fully assembled. I stepped out into the cool night air, ready for the curtain to rise on Brandon's final performance. The Grand Conservatory towered into the night sky, a breathtaking architectural marvel of vaulted glass and soaring palms. Inside, the humid air smelled heavily of imported jasmine, expensive perfume, and seared prime rib. Glowing crystal chandeliers cast a dazzle over tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns. This was the pinnacle of Chicago high society. Corporate titans and political figures moved through the crowd, holding crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. Brandon spared no expense, funding this coronation with the stolen $200,000 credit line drawn against my home. Near the grand entrance, Brandon stood holding court in a custom charcoal tuxedo. Standing half a step behind him in a silver sequined gown was Chloe Montgomery. Resting against her collarbone was a glittering diamond tennis necklace. She greeted arriving guests as the de facto wife, while Brandon's hand rested on the small of her back. Before I could take 3 steps into the main hall, a sharp manicured hand clamped down on my wrist. I turned to find my mother-in-law, Victoria Carter, flanked by Brandon's sister, Monica. "Evelyn," Victoria whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and heavy lavender perfume. "We made a slight adjustment to the seating arrangements. Given the high-profile political guests attending, we placed you somewhere less overwhelming." Monica chimed in with a fraudulent pout. "We wanted to spare you the anxiety of sustaining complex conversations, dear." Without waiting for my response, Victoria signaled to an usher. I was guided away from the epicenter of the room, past tables reserved for Chloe's political family. The usher pulled out a chair at a small table shoved directly into a dark corner by the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen doors clattered continuously, bringing the harsh smell of industrial dishwashers. My table lacked a centerpiece or a place card. Victoria had placed me in the shadows, executing a geographic erasure of my existence before the main show even began. I sat down calmly, smoothing the emerald silk of my gown over my knees. From my dark vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the ballroom. I watched Chloe's father, City Councilman Montgomery, clap Brandon affectionately on the shoulder. I watched Victoria float from table to table, planting seeds about my supposed instability. I watched Chloe lean up to whisper in Brandon's ear, laughing as he kissed her cheek in front of 200 people. They believed they were invincible, completely blind to the fact that the entire foundation was wired with explosives. The string quartet abruptly ceased playing. The ambient lighting dimmed, and the massive wraparound LED projection screens flickered to life. A hush fell over the room as Brandon straightened his tuxedo jacket and made his way toward the main stage. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my secure phone. I opened the thread with my brother-in-law, Marcus. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second, savoring the finality of the moment. I typed a single word, press send, and slipped the phone back into my purse. Execute. The sharp tap of a finger against the microphone echoed through the glass dome. Brandon stood at the center of the stage in a brilliant spotlight, offering the crowd a magnetic smile. Brandon leaned into the microphone, his voice a rich baritone. He began with false humility, thanking the guests for attending and nodding toward Councilman Montgomery. Then, exactly as his typed script dictated, the performance shifted. Brandon paused, lowering his gaze. His dazzling smile vanished, replaced by a mask of deeply practiced sorrow. When he spoke again, his voice dropped an octave, laced with a tremor of emotional exhaustion. He launched into a hypocritical monologue about the crushing burdens of a tragic marriage. He spoke about the pain of upholding sacred vows to a partner who had grown cold, distant, and callous. He painted himself as a stoic martyr met with emotional starvation and deceit. Several women in the front row gasped. As he reached the crescendo of his speech, Brandon gestured toward the base of the stage steps. Chloe stood bathed in the soft spillover of his spotlight. Brandon looked down at her with manufactured reverence, praising the rare, beautiful souls who stand by you when your world falls apart. Chloe gazed up at him, fully expecting to be called up to receive a grand public proposal. Across the room, Victoria and Monica stood nodding with vicious maternal pride. Brandon turned his gaze back to the audience, his expression hardening into determination. He told the audience he could no longer live in deception. He stated he had gathered them tonight to bear witness to the heartbreaking reality of his broken marriage. With a final dramatic sigh, Brandon looked up toward the audiovisual booth and gave a sharp, definitive nod, the signal to play the deepfake video. The remaining lights dimmed to a pitch-black void. Hundreds of elites held their breath. Brandon stood alone in the dark, waiting triumphantly for his masterpiece to begin. Up in the audiovisual booth, hidden behind exotic palms, Brandon's technicians panicked. Their silhouettes jerked in confusion, illuminated by the flashing red error messages of their locked-out consoles. Marcus's custom override script had locked them inside a digital quarantine. Down on the stage, Brandon's mask of sorrow began to crack. An irritated twitch appeared on his jaw. He tapped the microphone impatiently. The massive wraparound screens ignited, bathing the ballroom in a startling clinical white glow. The image that materialized was not the grainy hotel room of the fabricated deepfake. It was a crystal-clear, high-definition feed pulled directly from an international airport security camera. The timestamp flashed in stark red numbers, dating back to the exact weekend Brandon claimed he had been at a real estate conference in Wisconsin. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. The towering screens displayed the airport terminal at O'Hare. Brandon walked into the frame in his camel hair coat. A moment later, Chloe Montgomery rushed into the frame, throwing her arms around his neck. The camera angle was utterly merciless as the entire ballroom watched my husband and his mistress engage in a passionate kiss. Their faces were 20 feet high, broadcast across every wall. The silence shattered into scandalized gasps. Councilman Montgomery physically recoiled, his champagne glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the marble floor. Chloe let out a high, strangled sound of horror, her hands flying to cover her face as surrounding guests stepped away from her. On stage, the spotlight pinned Brandon like an insect on a board. The blood completely drained from his face as he stared up at the screens, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Marcus was far from finished. The airport footage snapped to black before a new visual seized the screens, a ruthless data visualization that moved with the efficiency of a corporate audit. An animated ledger displayed my personal real estate portfolio. A thick, glowing red line emerged from my assets, labeling the exact date and the staggering $200,000 amount of the home equity line of credit that Brandon had fraudulently authorized. The graphic tracked the stolen funds as they fractured into smaller streams through various holding entities before converging into a final destination, a high-resolution photograph of a 50-foot customized motor, yacht accompanied by the official bill of sale, displaying Brandon's forged signature. The low murmur of the crowd escalated into a roar of outrage. Corporate executives pulled out their phones, stepping away to initiate damage control. The yacht faded, replaced by a scanned legal document, ratification of financial obligations, and separate asset reservation agreement. Marcus had highlighted the key clauses in neon yellow, detailing that in the event of financial malfeasance or infidelity, the signatory surrendered all rights to the marital estate and assumed full personal liability. The camera zoomed in on Brandon's sprawling signature. Legal professionals in the room gasped as they realized my husband had legally bankrupted himself. The contract vanished, replaced by the stark seal of the Internal Revenue Service. Federal tax documents and audited ledgers flooded the screens. Marcus's team had constructed a damning web connecting Brandon's dummy corporations directly to his mother's accounts, exposing Victoria's charitable foundation as a systematic money laundering operation. Victoria let out a guttural wail as her high society reputation was publicly incinerated. Then the final connection materialized. The data visualization tracked the laundered money flowing out of Victoria's fake charities directly into the Political Action Committee, controlled by Councilman Montgomery. It laid bare the absolute truth. Brandon had financed a local political dynasty with dirty money, turning everyone connected to him into accomplices to a federal crime. The realization hit the ballroom like a shockwave. Councilman Montgomery watched his legacy, campaign, and freedom evaporate. Shock morphed into primal rage. He threw his glass aside, tore through the dense crowd, and stormed up the carpeted steps of the main stage. Chloe, trembling in her silver gown, reached out toward him. Councilman Montgomery did not hesitate or look at her. He stepped up to the main microphone, grabbing the stand with white-knuckled hands. His voice boomed through the speakers, cold and cutting. The Montgomery family and my campaign have been completely unaware of the illegal activities committed by these individuals, Councilman Montgomery declared. We sever all ties with Brandon Carter and Victoria Carter immediately, and we demand federal authorities prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Chloe reached out again, clutching at his sleeve. Councilman Montgomery coldly yanked his arm back, shoving her hands away. He turned his back on his weeping daughter, discarding her to preserve whatever fraction of his political life remained. He turned his fury directly onto Brandon, grabbing my husband by the lapels of his custom tuxedo and lifting him nearly off his feet, demanding to know what Brandon had done to his family. Brandon was reduced to a stammering, terrified shell, throwing his hands up to shield his face. Total chaos consumed the Grand Conservatory as power brokers scrambled toward the doors. On the stage, Councilman Montgomery shoved Brandon backward, sending him crashing onto the floor. At the foot of the stage stood Arthur Sterling, the CEO of Brandon's firm. Sterling pulled a phone from his pocket and dialed the direct line to the regional director of the FBI, reporting corporate embezzlement and wire fraud in real time. Brandon looked at Sterling, then up at the screens displaying his forged signatures. A raw shriek of manic disbelief ripped from his throat. He crawled toward the edge of the stage, begging Sterling for a chance to explain, pleading for mercy, screaming for his technicians to turn off the projectors. But his life was entirely eradicated. Near the exit, Victoria and Monica tried to flee, but the brass doors were pushed open from the outside. My father, Arthur Bennett, stepped into the threshold, flanked by 2 armed security contractors. Immovable and stern, Arthur blocked their escape route. Arthur produced a sealed manila envelope and thrust it against Victoria's chest. A courtesy copy of your impending federal indictment for wire fraud and conspiracy, Arthur said. Victoria stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade, her jaw slackening. I stood up from my isolated table by the kitchen doors, smoothed my emerald silk gown, and picked up my glass of sparkling water. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly through the epicenter of the devastation. I moved through the screaming crowd with absolute serenity. I passed the stage, ignoring Brandon's pathetic sobs as he curled into a fetal position. I ignored Chloe weeping on the floor. I kept my pace steady toward the grand exit. As I reached the vestibule, Monica stood paralyzed beside her mother. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized who had orchestrated their downfall. I did not smile or whisper a threat. I simply stopped, extended my arm, and pressed my crystal glass of water directly into Monica's trembling hand, a silent, final confirmation of her complete irrelevance to my future. I turned my back on Monica, on Victoria's hyperventilating panic, and on the distant, echoing screams of my ruined husband. I stepped through the grand double doors into the cool, crisp night air. A profound, absolute stillness washed over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 5 years vanished completely. My shoulders relaxed. My chest expanded, drinking in the clean, freezing air. The chaos inside the glass dome was a dying fire behind me. I was completely, irrevocably free. The morning sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet streets of suburban Chicago. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the gentle scent of damp earth and fresh pine. Golden light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my kitchen, illuminating the polished oak table where my journey of reclamation had begun 3 months ago. I stood by the window, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The rich aroma drifted upward, warm and comforting. I wore a simple white cashmere sweater and relaxed denim. My skin glowed with health. The deep, dark circles that had once shadowed my eyes were completely gone. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air expand my lungs. For the first time in 5 years, my chest felt light and entirely unburdened. 3 weeks after the disaster at the Grand Conservatory, the legal and financial fallout had settled into absolute order. My attorney, Marcus Vance, had executed the ratified postnuptial agreement with ruthless precision. The Cook County Court formally restored the full title of my 3-bedroom home to my maiden name. The forged $200,000 home equity line of credit was completely wiped from my credit record, assigned entirely as personal criminal liability to Brandon. Through my whistleblower filing with the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, my father and the federal prosecutors secured the recovery of my stolen savings. The liquid assets Brandon had attempted to absorb into his fraudulent LLC were seized and returned to my private trust account. I was not just whole. I was financially independent, secure, and entirely self-governing. The news outlets had reported extensively on the scandal, but I no longer watched the broadcasts or read the headlines. Brandon Carter and his mother, Victoria, were currently awaiting trial in federal custody, facing multiple counts of wire fraud, bank forgery, and tax evasion. Their high society ties had evaporated overnight. Chloe Montgomery's family had moved out of the state, her father's political career permanently ruined. Yet, as I stared out at the quiet garden, I felt no surge of malicious triumph. I felt no lingering anger, no bitter satisfaction, and no desire for revenge. The anger that had once burned like boiling oil in my veins had completely evaporated, leaving behind a vast, tranquil sea of peace. I had stopped asking why the betrayal happened. I stopped replaying the painful memories of Brandon's condescending words or Victoria's cruel insults. I stopped looking back. I realized that my survival and eventual victory were not about defeating them, but about reclaiming myself. My transformation was complete. I had shed the fragile, self-sacrificing identity of the invisible wife who begged for validation. I had stopped playing the helpless victim, waiting for someone to fix my life. Through clear analytical thinking, disciplined physical training, rigorous legal preparation, and unyielding self-respect, I had taken full ownership of my destiny. I had earned my executive financial risk certification, earning a major promotion at my firm along with a substantial salary increase. I was no longer just managing numbers for others. I was directing the course of my own life. The back door opened softly, and my father walked out onto the stone patio. Arthur Bennett wore a warm cardigan, carrying his own cup of tea. He stood beside me, his weathered face relaxed, his gray eyes filled with profound warmth and quiet pride. The cool morning breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree above us. "The air is remarkably clear today, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice a gentle rumble. "It is, Dad," I replied, turning to look at him. "Everything is clear." My father placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. "You fought a hard battle, Khan, but you did not let their rot enter your heart. You built a fortress out of your own strength." "I learned from the best," I said softly, resting my hand over his. Arthur smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression that erased the decades of pain he had carried from his own past. He had watched his daughter break the cycle of deception that had once ruined his youth. Together, we had turned a bitter family tragedy into a testament of resilience and justice. I stepped off the patio and walked onto the damp grass of the backyard. The golden sunlight wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant cheerful chirping of morning birds. The metallic clatter of airport terminals, the cold scent of empty safes, and the suffocating atmosphere of the Grand Conservatory were distant echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. I opened my eyes and looked up at the vast, clear blue sky. A soft, genuine smile touched my lips. I was 30 years old, standing on the solid foundation of my own making. I owed nothing to anyone. I feared nothing. I was no longer defined by the betrayal I had suffered, but by the unshakable strength I had discovered within myself. Standing in the brilliant warmth of the golden hour, I took a deep, peaceful breath. I was whole. I was victorious. I was forever free. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below so we know we're walking this journey together. Hope to see you on the next page.